Good afternoon and welcome to the Alberta Land Institute Research Showcase. My name is Eran Kaplinsky and I'm the Research Director for ALI. With me today is ALI Director Dave Poulton and the ALI team, including Hannah and Kevin, who will help me to moderate the discussion. If this is your first ALI event, we are an independent research institute based at the University of Alberta, and we are committed to promoting, advancing research in the service of better land use and land management in the province and beyond. Please visit our website to learn more about our work. We are broadcasting to you today from Treaty 6 territory. The University of Alberta respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First People of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Our purpose today is to showcase 3 recent cutting-edge projects conducted by 3 of our excellent research partners and their teams. We are very proud to have supported this work. We will have Dr. Sandeep Agrawal, Professor and Director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Alberta, and he will present his research on the communication of risk in Alberta municipalities.
Thanks so much, Iran. Thanks for inviting me. So for the rest of you, you're going to hear another planner talking about planning stuff, but it's going to be a little bit different. It's about risk communication. And again, this project is funded by the Alberta Land Institute, and it's titled Say It Loud and Clear, Understanding Risk Communication in Canadian Municipalities, but we focused on Alberta. I want to give a shout out to Hannah Ambry. She's here in the audience, I know. And I would at some point pull her in if there are difficult questions posed to me. Deb Parida is another PhD student in my lab who helped us out. And Nilakshi Joshi, who's no longer in Canada, moved to Germany recently. But again, without whom this study wouldn't have been possible. So just to get into the meat of the presentation, one of the key challenges for municipalities across Canada is coping with future threats from natural hazards and environmental risks, and especially as the frequency and intensity of these events are shifting and increasing due to climate change. Recent disaster events in Canada, including Quebec's 2019 spring floods, BC's 2018 wildfires. We all know about Fort McMurray's 2016 wildfires and how much they have impacted communities, and of course raise questions as to how municipalities understand and manage risk for their residents. And I also want to point out the extreme temperature that we experienced over the summer months in Alberta as well as in BC, and the unprecedented amount of recent heavy rain and mudslide again in parts of BC. So from previous literature, we found that most provinces in Canada use a variety of strategies to deal with disaster risk, and they range from structural mitigation to adaptation, behavioral changes, and things of that in nature. And more recently, following the Canadian government's endorsement of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, the idea of risk communication has become more and more important as a key risk management strategy. And just about Sendai framework, this was adopted at the 3rd UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, and it outlines different targets, priorities for action to prevent any new and reduce the existing disaster risks. So as an emerging area of practice in the Canadian context, this study aims to understand how risk is communicated across key stakeholders. In our case, we're focused on municipalities, so property owners, homeowners, municipal government, provincial governments, developers, builders. So those were our key stakeholders. and how this understanding or lack thereof impacts existing and future urban development processes. So in the context of Alberta, recent triggers of events such as the Calgary floods in 2013, I mentioned Fort McMurray wildfire in 2016, which were put together the costliest disaster in Canadian history, about $6 billion, have brought in more attention to risk management. So previous studies in Alberta have done some work in understanding risk and the communication of risk, but they lack on two scores. First is there is the state of knowledge regarding risk communication, the measures that are taken for risk communication by stakeholders across municipalities in Alberta is largely unclear. And second, it is also unclear as to what extent these risk communication strategies challenge the community's perception of risk. So those are the two things that are missing. So that's what we wanted to study here. And this leads to the question that we have asked and that has guided the rest of the work. And the question is, in what ways does risk communication impact and or interact with urban development processes in municipalities in Alberta? So to answer this question, we chose a number of municipalities. But before I get to that, just wanted to say that 6 of Canada's 10 costliest disasters have occurred in the province of Alberta between 2010 and 2020. So we should keep that in mind as we sort of move through this presentation. So within the province, we selected 5 case studies to explore the question that I mentioned, and they are Canmore, High River, Fort Vermilion, Calgary, and Fort McMurray. And these case studies were selected based on their size and the history of disasters that they have faced. So these municipalities all had experience with a recent disaster event and had identified or have identified multiple natural hazards such as floods, wildfires, ice jams, steep creeks hazards, and so on and so forth. And in some instances, there have been compounding of these hazards, creating a need for advancing the idea of risk communication and strategies. So I will get into the details of these case studies before I move on to the findings. So 5 case studies, as I mentioned. Factors that come into play in selecting these case studies were population size, as I mentioned, known natural hazards and the diversity of these hazards, and then recent major disaster events. And we gleaned some of these information from the Canada Disaster Database. So what we have here is one large municipality, that is Calgary, one medium-sized municipality, let's say, of the regional municipality of Buffalo, RMWB, and Fort McMurray is part of that. One small-sized municipality, that's Canmore, with a highly transient population, and 2 small municipalities of High River and the hamlet of Fort Vermilion. And I just wanted to say, you would see a number of smaller municipalities is partly because some of the previous work show that the smaller municipalities have faced a lot more disastrous events and lacked the real strategies of risk communication. So just quickly going over these case studies, Calgary has faced several natural disasters, from river flooding, extreme cold, heat, drought, blizzard, tornado, I mean, you name it, Calgary has faced all of it. We clearly remember the floods of 2013, which cost about $2 billion. Last year's hailstorm in Calgary cost over $1 billion. So you can see how much of damage has happened just in the city of Calgary. Fort McMurray, which I mentioned before, an urban service area of RMWB has had natural disasters of floods due to ice jamming, unstable ground, of course, wildfire. I mentioned the 2016 wildfire that led to the evacuation of about 100,000 people, destruction of homes and businesses, and cost about $4 billion. Canmore, and it's an interesting case study, is exposed to multiple natural hazards, overland floods, ground subsidence, wildfires, steep creek hazards. The major disaster, most recent, was the Cougar Creek flood, which is a steep creek event caused by debris that flowed down the creek from the mountains, resulted in damage to scores of homes, evacuation of hundreds of people. Fort Vermilion, a hamlet in Mackenzie County, flooding by ice jamming is a recurring event in the area. But most recently, and back in 2020, the ice blockage on the Peace River caused ice jam flooding, which led to massive damage to large parts of Fort Vermilion and evacuation of about 500 people. Lastly, High River, a town south of Calgary along Highwood River, has faced natural hazards from overland flooding, wildfire, extreme weather events, and the floods back in 2013 inundated over 60% of the town, causing about 13,000 people to be evacuated from 5,000 homes. So just to give you an extent of what has happened over the course of last decade or so in these municipalities. So our study used a qualitative approach, drawing from document analysis, key informant interviews. We did about 22 interviews, and they included municipal officials who were responsible for addressing risk. They included climate change specialists, land use planners, emergency managers. We also spoke with provincial officials who are responsible for emergency management. We have had interviews with developers who had experience building in risk-prone areas, disaster-affected communities. We also interviewed insurance agency representatives here in Alberta to get their perspective. And lastly, we also spoke with folks from different neighborhoods that got affected, from Calgary to Fort McMurray and other places, neighborhood associations as well. So for each of these selected case studies, we triangulated the interview data with the existing municipal plans and land use regulations, and we came up with broad themes, and which is what I'm going to dwell upon in the next few minutes. But before I get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about some theories involved. And again, I don't want to go too much deep into it, but I think it's important to understand what the theories tell us and how they, or whether they align with what we observed in Alberta. There are a number of theories, but what we did was we categorized them into 5 broad ones. So risk perception theory focus on how risk is understood and processed by individuals and groups. So commonly identified factors include the type of risk, the context of risk, the personalities of individuals involved, and the social context. Information source theories are about the level of trust in the institutions. So higher is communities' trust in authorities and institutions, higher is the mitigation and adaptation measures taken by the community. So the scholars suggest that the institutional trust built through transparency and participation is important for risk governance and management. Risk framing is quite important. So risk framing theories emphasize the role of some influential groups of folks such as public officials, elected officials, and how they present or frame risk, which affect the perception of risk and the likelihood of citizens undertaking different kinds of preparations to mitigate risk. Participation theories are about public engagement, participation in the risk communication, meaning the risk information should not just flow from one way, from, let's say, from experts to lay people, but also the other way as well, that the idea of public as a knowledgeable entity and the way to empower them for them to become much more resilient. Place-based attachment theory, and this is This is a key when it comes to Alberta. And this is about how emotional and cognitive attachment affect perception and coping of risk. So one effect is that individuals who feel strong place attachment may refuse to evacuate, or they may likely to return to affected areas after the disaster, despite the fact that the possibility of recurrence of disaster is quite high. So a few findings that I'm going to talk about today. The first one is risk communication in Alberta is practiced through 4 key approaches: strategic actions, public engagement, local municipal planning, and media and marketing. So all in all, what we observed that in our case studies, significant changes were made through land use regulations and bylaws and changes in municipal development plan. So mostly opting for more technical legal framework to deal with new and emerging risks. So we'll quickly go through the 4 approaches as used in Alberta. So strategic actions, as I just mentioned, involve either relying on existing institutions or creating new forms of institution pathways. So for instance, Calgary has now no build approach in areas that are identified as high risk. Canmore has an now updated MDP, which identifies 100-year flood zones, and then it mapped it out. It categorizes risk in multiple groups and what type of development can occur in which type of risk group. So quite detailed in that respect. Fort Vermilion asked for safety certificates from professionals like engineers and architects involved in new development. So those are the kind of things that Alberta municipalities have used in terms of strategic action. In regards to public engagement, what we noticed was kind of limited. Calgary's engagement framework seems to be more robust than others, much more evolved. Local planning initiative focus on the process through which new development projects are negotiated, executed in the municipalities. And we did find, as I mentioned before, some significant changes in the MDPs and bylaws and such. But overall planning approach across all our case studies was aligned largely towards mitigation, not so much about adaptation. So recommendations were in regards to flood-proofing the structures, fireproofing the structures, creation of localized risk mapping. As a major mitigation project is the Cougar Creek debris flood retention structure in Canmore, which is currently underway. So those are the kind of things that have happened under local planning initiative. Lastly, about media and marketing. It is an emerging form of risk communication, includes newspaper ads, brochure, websites, TV ads, and so on and so forth, social media posts. The town of River still seems to rely on the old technique of going to door and distributing brochures. Calgary seemed to be a little bit more systematic. They have developed a flood readiness guide for citizens and seasonal newsletters. They have a web resource called the Calgary Disaster Risk Explorer website, and it's fairly detailed in that respect. Second finding is risk perception across state actors as well as homeowners play a key role in risk communication practice. So we found that 3 key factors influence how risk is perceived. Place attachment, I mentioned before, prior experience with hazard risks, and public memory of disaster. And these 3 factors play a key role in how different stakeholders perceive risk and act to mitigate and prepare for future events. So homeowners, especially property owners, attachment to their home and community has tremendous ability to change how risk is perceived, prepared for, and mitigated. Communities' prior experience with hazard and hazard events are more physically and emotionally compared to those who have not experienced disasters for many years. And lastly, public memory in the aftermath of disaster provides a crucial window of opportunity to make a meaningful change, because as as the days and years pass, people begin to forget as to what they faced just a few weeks or a couple of years ago. The third is key determinant of risk communication efficacy in municipality is how risk is framed. So each stakeholder across our case study would frame and describe hazard in different ways and add a different perspective depending upon the context. So one way of framing risk communication is to portray it as something positive that relates to people's daily lives, rather than something which is very negative, needs to be done when the emergency comes. So here is a quote that I'm going to cite here. This is from one of the municipal officials, and this person says, quote, "I kind of try to frame it in a context of we do risk management in every piece of our life without even necessarily knowing about it. You have insurance on your car. You wear a winter jacket when you're going outside. You check the weather. You change your tires. So I try to give people some examples that they can hopefully relate to, rather than just do when something bad happens." So I think that quote is quite powerful in that respect. And finally, this is the fourth finding. This is about information deficit. So information deficit between the actors involved in risk management and urban development processes is a key barrier to risk communication. And there are two types of information deficit that we saw. First is most communication across municipalities is shaped by technical knowledge of risk. That may be completely gobbledygook to the residents of the city. And second, we found is that risk information is fragmented as it moves from, let's say, from the province to municipalities to developers and builders down to homeowners. And this is a quote to substantiate all of this. Quote, I'm just reading the red text here. There's one master plan community at the end of our downtown that is designed to flood. I'm sure it is said in a sarcastic way, but that's also never communicated to buyers. So these people who bought those homes would have used their garage area for storage or things of that in nature, and they have seen significant losses. So there's a fundamental breakdown in the system. So that's what this person says. So just to, again, sum up the next couple of slides, we find Alberta employs, or rather Alberta municipalities employ a one-size-fits-all approach towards risk management, largely through the risk mapping, the flood mapping and such. Some regulatory changes have been made, structural mitigation, as I mentioned about the Cougar Creek debris structure. So the dominant form of communication is mostly technical in nature. And in some cases, it gives us sort of a false sense of safety. So that's a bit of a problem. The attachment that people have to places plays a key role in how public homeowners in particular and business owners perceive and cope with risk. And the third is that there's a direct relation between how risks are framed and how they impact public behavior. So the current framing of risk is flawed. And what we think is that Calgary is the only one that is working to shift to normalizing risk preparedness and mitigation by trying to frame risk not as something that is to be scared of, but something that is meant to empower people. The fourth is current risk communication practices rooted in technical knowledge disempowers vulnerable groups. And lastly, in the absence of multiple stakeholders, managing risk as shared responsibility rather than just a governmental responsibility, residents and homeowners continue to remain in harm's way. So key implications for risk communication. There are four here. First, a lack of cooperation among stakeholders results in the maintenance of status quo of risk communication and management practices. potentially creates new system-induced risk. Second, not enough attention given to the temporal aspect of the risk management. As I mentioned before, we found that the initial 2-3 years in the aftermath of the disaster is absolutely the key in successfully implementing any risk policy and practice. And third is the creation of active pathways through public participation and education has strong potential for long-term cultural shifts in risk awareness. And finally, a combination of competing priorities between and among actors and a deficit in transfer of risk knowledge contributes towards a culture of mistrust, and something needs to be done to overcome that. All right, so two sort of broad recommendations for policymakers and planners. First is to promote more transparent and effective risk communication across municipalities. And there must be a long-term focus on improving risk. This is across the province. And second is for a smoother urban development process that recognizes existing and future risk. Both policy and practice must focus on integration and increased cooperation among and between stakeholders. So lastly, just to conclude, a study found that risk communication is practiced through multiple approaches across the scale of governance. We identified gaps in the risk management and communication in Alberta, such as differential risk knowledge, lack of integration of knowledge. But despite these gaps, the present communication system has the potential to evolve into more integrated, robust system if the communities are empowered and if we can somehow break down the siloed approach that's currently being followed. So I think with that, I will end my presentation and thank you for listening, and I'm open to questions, and I will also invite Hannah to contribute to the questions and answers.
Both of you are now under the lights, and while everyone is formulating your question, let me ask, if I live in one community or another, what's my best course of action right now if I want to know what kind of risks I'm facing? Is there somewhere I can call, in the municipality to find out? Should I talk to my insurer? If I'm a home buyer, how do I find out what I'm dealing with?
Excellent question, Iran. It just depends where you are. If you are in smaller municipalities, I think it'll be tough. I think you may have to go to multiple sources. You may have to even go to the provincial sources to look at their flood mapping. You could call your municipality. Again, if it's a small municipality, there may not be a person responsible for this. So you may get shunted around. There may be some information on the website, but it may not be all complete. But having said that, I would say Calgary has the best system so far and framework that we have observed, and they do have multiple units within the municipal system that talk to each other. They actually have created a special position for this person who liaises between the risk people and the communication people, as well as land use planners. So again, it just depends where you are situated in Alberta. And I also mentioned that, let's say if you're buying a property, if you're buying a home, you have to do your own due diligence, because developers will not tell you, because, hey, you know what, they got the permission to build it, so they will tell you, about the permission they got. Real estate people will tell you just the information they have. So yeah, it's entirely, onus is on you to buyer beware situation.
I have a follow-up question, and I don't know if this comes up in the research. Does the specific risk that a some land or property is subject to, is that risk going to be reflected in the market price, in the municipal assessment, and obviously in the insurance rates? How are we doing in Alberta?
No, it's not. Not at least in the price, because the price would only change, again, and Hannah could add to this, price would only change if a lien or something is attached to the title. So that's something the title says that, hey, you know what, there is some risk involved. Higher insurance rate will only occur if the insurance tells you that you're in a risk-prone area. But other than that, I can't think of any other way to figure it out. Hannah, do you have a better answer than I have?
No, I don't think so. I think when we spoke to a lot of our interviewees, they spoke about how there's not something on the title right now talking about the risk. And that's one of the ways that they said would be the best way to communicate risk to homeowners moving forward. Since all the risk currently comes down to the property owner, having a way for it to be on that title would be the most beneficial. But yeah, currently it's kind of up, as Sandeep mentioned, up to the homeowner to kind of figure out what they're dealing with on their own property and in their individual community.
So let me just qualify what Hannah said. Our interviewees, where they did mention attaching something to the title, but they were very reluctant about it because it's sort of a hammer approach. And let's say it's a new subdivision and the municipality attaches these risks to the title. The developer and builder will be completely opposed to it. How could you approve the subdivision and then you're attaching these lien or
Sorry, Sandeep, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that there's a reluctance to do that. And as I said, there is a bit of a conflicting messages from the municipality. On one hand, you're approving a new subdivision, and then the other hand, you're attaching a lien to the title.
I have one more question. You talked about the technical presentation of some of the information relating to risk. What would be the next generation or means of presenting information? How could we communicate things in a way that's less technical, more visual, or more simplified for the property owner?
So I'm going to answer it in two ways. One is, what information should be provided to new buyers, new home buyers, and how do you provide that information? I think some of that responsibility does lie on developers and builders. Some of the responsibility also lies on real estate agents when you have an existing property changing hands. So that's one way. In terms of existing homeowners, I think there needs to be a better communication, a regular, continuous communication between the municipality and homeowners. There are neighborhood associations. They seem to be much more engaged and knowledgeable about such things. They are in regular contact with the municipalities. But what we hear is that their membership come back to us and they say, well, our immediate problem is this railway track where this train comes and gets stuck and we cannot cross the river, rather than flooding, which probably happened 5 years ago. So how do you deal with an immediate, imminent situation versus something that may or will happen in the future? And that again needs to be figured out between the neighborhood association and the municipality, and of course the public needs to be engaged on that. So it needs to be both, short-term issues as well as long-term issues. Hannah?
Yeah, I think to add to that, one of the approaches is in the long term is kind of to educate the citizens starting at a young age about what risks exist within the municipality. So Calgary is starting to do this, especially through online courses for children that they're doing in schools, and also disaster risk courses. So one step they're taking is just trying to make citizens aware of the risks. So hopefully when that's applied to their property or their communities, they can acknowledge those risks and prepare better. So just taking a look at the larger picture and what some municipalities are starting to consider as an important step in kind of empowering citizens to take steps to prepare.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think children are the best. I mean, schools, they're the future citizens. They even change the behaviors of their parents. Just imagine the 60s and 70s when we never wore our seatbelts in the cars, and today, you know, everyone does. And my kids, I keep the lights on and they come and complain, you know, what about environment and sustainability and such. So I take Hannah's point. I think it needs to be inculcated in the schools.
Thanks. Can I invite one of our members of the audience to maybe contribute or ask a question? I do notice that we have several representatives of local government joining us today.
Yeah, hi, this is Sherry from Okotoks. I'm the climate change and energy specialist in Okotoks. So, and I find that like your presentation was great, Sandeep, and it's really gives us some talking points for to implement things in our community. When it comes to, I mean, we're doing a similar thing with the Clean Energy Improvement Program. If a landowner or a homeowner is putting something like a renewable energy project on the house, and they've got a caveat to pay back the municipality after they leave, like that's getting, I mean, that's municipally, we're allowed to do that. We've got the jurisdiction to do that, but people are still like, "Ooh, I don't want that on my house," right? And that got a lot of pushback. Those pay style programs got a lot of pushback in California. So putting caveats is always a bit of a touchy subject, but I think it's really important because we can say buyer beware all we like, but the systems are built to make things complicated for homeowners, right? So, and we're trying to make them a bit easier, but politically speaking, it's not. We have so many systems and they have so many things they need to go through. And sometimes the people who are buying the home or the people who are moving in don't necessarily have the language or the ability to read all of the paperwork that's there, whether they have the language or not, or are in a hurry to move in because they've been given a short window of opportunity or whatever it is. And we're not all legal experts. So I think that finding some kind of structure where we can support our landowners and our residents in, even if it's not a caveat, but a one-stop shop for data management and stuff like that, that will allow those risks to be communicated to the landowner. So you can only look one place, right? Because you're right, we're trying to form relationships with real estate agents and developers so that they give the information ahead of time, but everybody's got their own prerogative, right? Communicating risk is a really difficult thing when there are so many places the risk is coming from.
No, yeah, very well said, Sherry. And and maybe it's a question back to you. I'm not very sure whether Alberta even allows caveat, the type of caveat we are talking about, attached to titles, land titles.
Yeah, I don't remember what the ins and outs. I mean, I used to work in oil and gas, and we put caveats are put on for developments and oil and gas jurisdictions or oil and gas leases and that kind of stuff. So I can't remember what the exact. We'd have to go look it up, but
yeah.
But you're right. They might not be allowed. So what's the option, right? It can't be just you need a PhD in legal, right? And land management to be able to figure out what the risks are with your house.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it as you said, I mean, it is very political. I mean, so much so that the province, when it does the mapping, municipalities can accept or not accept that mapping depending upon who or what it is affecting in their jurisdiction. So even a technical exercise like mapping, which is supposedly evidence-based, is very, very political. So just imagine the rest of it, which is much more political with,
Oh, 100%. We've been waiting for the provincial maps, for flood maps for ages, right? Because we had some funding to do our own, but we didn't want that out there if it was going to conflict with the provincial mapping. So then we're still waiting for the provincial 1 in 200 year flood mapping, right?
Yeah,
And that's only one risk,
that's right.
right? All the other risks are not, yeah. And they need the funding, they need the people who know how to do it, and then we need a tool to be able to communicate it, and I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, and provincial mapping, the scale is different. And when it comes down to municipal, every piece of parcel get affected. And then what comes out of that. Whosoever's parcel is within that map, then they would complain to their locally elected official. And so yes, it is a highly politically charged process.
Yeah, and it interferes with competitive business and the whole thing. Like, it ties into so many things that but as a municipality, it is our job to make sure that our residents have those tools or have access to some of those tools. So if they're out there, we'd like to be able to at least point people in the right direction. And we're public servants. That's what we're supposed to do, right? Is serve our public.
I wanted to add a point about what can or cannot be registered on title, and as someone who comes from the legal industry, the whole point is for the legal regime to enable what needs to be enabled. So if someone can give a legal answer as to whether something like this is or isn't registrable, and let's say that it isn't, then if it needs to be fixed, it can be fixed.
Yeah, but again, changing legislation is an inherently political process.
That's right. Yeah.
And I just wanted to say that we thoroughly enjoyed our project. And as I mentioned, we spoke with insurance folks, we talked with mortgage lenders, banks, we talked with municipal folks, provincial folks. And what we found was that just a siloed approach. Insurance folks don't really talk with bank folks. Banks are not talking with the municipal people, and so on and so forth. And that is the reason that you see that in some instances where we actually, we witnessed areas developed which were known. I mean, the risk was known. Municipality approved the development. Mortgages were approved by the banks, and people got the insurance. And then, hell got loose when a fire came or the flood came. So what we are seeing is the easiest way out for municipalities generally is to take mitigation measures that somehow through technical engineering ways we could solve the problem of flooding or steep creek hazard or what have you. And a lot of that is happening. It costs money, but it is happening in Canmore. You go to other places as well. $4 million, the dam is being built, and they're thinking, well, when that dam is built, then everything will be fine. High River and other places, Fort McMurray. So yeah, it's mostly engineering solutions that are being worked upon.
100%. I was just going to say, from a municipal point of view, it's because we still need taxpayers to pay for the rest of it, right? So we're not going to say no to developers. Okotoks tried that. We put a population cap on it didn't work. People just build on our edges, and we had no control over it.
Yeah, and then Okotoks annexed more.
And then we had to annex more land, yeah, to make up for, right? So, and the reason we annexed that land is because it was developers were already building on our borders.
Right.
because they were undermining our population cap, right?
Mhm.
Sandeep, it seems that everything is connected together. I'll just make a note that climate change and risk continues to be an area of priority for Alberta Land Institute. This is by no means the last that we have said about this. And if you have any ideas for us, if you know of research gaps where we can be useful, please let us know. We can't make any promises, but it is our mandate to improve land policy in this province, as I mentioned before, and dealing with risk and climate change is a very significant component of that increasingly.
Mhm.
I was just gonna say, is there work being done on ecosystem services and work on lands on more justification for bigger municipal reserve and environmental reserve in municipalities?
Thanks, Kevin. I actually I just had a comment, and it was very closely related to Sherry's, and I was wondering, Sandeep, you referred to this sort of bias towards engineered solutions as a means of avoiding having to deal with the confrontational aspects of risk mitigation and risk communication. And at the same time, it appears that we're using technical solutions as a communications mechanism, and it seems to either one of those dictate against giving full consideration to green infrastructure and recognition of existing ecosystem services from natural ecosystems. And, I think the bias towards gray engineered infrastructure is pretty evident in a lot of the ways we plan these things. But I wonder if this is a different way that we're reinforcing that bias.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Dave. Only other point I would add is that even these engineering solutions are in a way communicating risk, but actually what it is saying is communicating that we have control over risk, we have taken care of it. And I think this is sort of then reverberates within the community that, hey, it has already been taken care of, then what is the problem? And it gives us false sense of security among homeowners. This is what we have seen in Canmore and in Fort McMurray and other places. So this engineering solutions, because it's a physical manifestation happening next door to these folks who have gotten affected, and they take much more solace in what the municipality is doing for them, quite frankly, than through brochures or website or what have you. And that's where the bias lies mostly. I would give, again, full credit to Calgary. I think they are working on multiple fronts. While they're finding engineering solutions, they are working through much more innovative, creative means of actual communication with public, involving private sectors, developers, builders, community associations, to make Calgarians aware of the current imminent risk as well as future risks. Well, thank you very much, Iran, for the opportunity, and thank you so much, Hannah. Sorry I put you in such a bad. But thank you. And Hannah was an absolutely wonderful member of the team. Again, I couldn't have done without her. So thank you to Hannah and Iran for letting her work with us.
Started a few hours ago when it was nice and sunny outside, and it's almost getting dark. So we really appreciate everyone giving us your time, the presenters most of all, but everybody, thanks for spending the afternoon with us. You can see more of our work and more about this work on our website. Write to us if you require more information, or we can help communicate in any other way. And we look forward to seeing all of you in future ALI events.